Another thing about the way that the collection works is that there were some challenges. We know in English Canadian literary history, we know about Stephen Leacock as a humorist. We know about other people, including Emily Murphy in this region, who wrote humorous travel narratives about their experiences in the Rocky Mountains and in other places in Canada. But there really is not a lot that is available, not only to researchers, but just to people who are interested, about people who did writing like what Nello Vernon Wood did, and that because he wrote popular stuff. He wrote for what we call ephemera, magazines, especially American magazines. He didn't write for Canadian magazines very much, if at all, just the Canadian Alpine Journal and a couple of others. So he really is a figure who is a journalist. He is writing for money, right, in order to make money. He's also trying to figure out how to make his experiences understandable and marketable to a very specific demographic, which is wealthy Americans who were interested in hunting and fishing and coming as tourists to Banff. And so he is part of a group of writers who often get left out of the discussion when we start thinking about the history of this kind of writing in the country. And so we really thought that that was part of the story as well. So that was another reason why we wanted to make these works available. We wouldn't necessarily read them today. In fact, I don't think we should read them today the way that they would have been read back then. We are not the target audience in a lot of ways. But as scholars, both Andrew and I thought that it would be not only important, but also very interesting for all kinds of readers to have a window, as Andrew said, into what it was like to live then, but also what it was like to write then, so that we can have a more complete picture of what professional writing looked like in this country at that time.
For me, it was a fascinating way to connect my family history in Canada, in Alberta, in the Rockies specifically, to my own scholarly interests, which are in medieval history. Well, what does that have to do with the Rockies, you might ask? I'm particularly interested in ephemeral writing, in non-literary writing, and the kinds of things that were published for less educated or even uneducated audiences in the later Middle Ages and the first part of the 16th century, the Reformation and Renaissance periods, because those are understudied as well, or have been historically. And so there's an interesting kind of strange parallel between what I do professionally as a historian and my interest in this non-literary or quasi-literary genre, I guess, this professional genre. Yeah. And so working with Julie, I learned a great deal about precisely these questions of professional writing versus, say, literary writing, the differences between the study of literary texts as traditionally conceived and the study of things like this, which require a very different approach, I think. And in writing our introduction to the volume as a whole and in writing the introductions to the specific pieces, we had to deal with the fact that these are not addressed to us or to our contemporaries. They're written from a very different perspective in a very different period with different worldviews and values and ideas about different kinds of people. So there are some passages that require explication. That's why this is a scholarly book and not just an edition of the stories without any commentary.
My own interest is that I've done a lot of work on mountaineering and with some work focused in the parks and women's issues. And so I was really interested to get to look at what is it like to be a man in the Rockies? What is it like to be a man at this period? And one thing we found, and we weren't expecting to find this when we started, was that Tex Wood in his persona is actually quite good at talking about what it's like and how complicated it is to be a man in the Rockies at this time, because he's writing about a time of transition, as Andrew said, from the time when you could be a guide and you could be interested in hunting and fishing, and not only interested in it, but making a living from it. And then you also have to turn yourself into a tour guide. This is a time of transition for the parks. It is a time of transition about what manliness in the wilderness is going to mean. Tex was a guide. He was also an early park ranger, one of the early rangers who had the attitudes of the bush. Okay, and later on, the role of the park ranger changed significantly, and other people have written about that. But he actually was one of those early adventurous park rangers who went through the Rockies on his horse, and who knew how to do and how to camp in ways that would be seen as frontier ways. He knew about that kind of stuff. He probably knew some dialect that Aboriginal people spoke in this area. He probably knew who some of them were and worked with them. He makes a lot of reference to them. Those kinds of ways of being a park ranger vanished later on. So that was another thing that was important to us.
Well, there's some other historical references. Mary Vaux and her husband, Charles Walcott, the Smithsonian geologist who worked on the Burgess Shale, and Tex was involved in in guiding that couple, both on naturalist and other kinds of expeditions. He was a member of the Yellowhead expedition in 1911. He was around for the first sort of skiing in the Banff area. It wasn't his idea, and he wasn't doing it. It was Cliff White who was central to that effort. But that's reflected in some of his stories. In fact, many of these historical episodes, or what from our perspective now look like important sort of punctuation marks in Banff history, are referred to in his stories. They're not the theme of the story. So the Vaux Walcotts show up in his stories, but they're not the theme of the story. The Yellowhead expedition is in there somewhere as well. Encounters with university-trained park rangers, in which he beats up the park ranger eventually because he's so annoying. Figure as well, and that's a kind of veiled commentary on this new kind of ranger, the new kind of management of the park. That's all built into the stories. It's not explicit, and it's not thematized at all.
We didn't think that it should be primarily a scholarly audience. What we wanted to do was provide all kinds of readers with the tools that they need to be a little bit critical about what Banff means as a park, as a place that is a tourist place, and what the characters of Banff could mean. So there's a lot of fabulous picture books out there about Banff and its characters. There's a lot of really interesting information available in places like the White Museum about what Banff looked like during this period. But there's not always a lot of thinking about how complicated things could get. So we're saying that our readership is going to be people who are interested in the parks and are interested in the history of Banff. Some of those people might be scholars, but some of those people might not be. They might just be interested and want more information about how to understand those images and those people from the past. And so I think that we shouldn't make a difference between ordinary readers, so to speak, and the trained ones, Just like I think Tex Wood as a writer wrote for a certain clientele and wasn't writing literary stuff. So just like we wanted to look at someone who was a little more ordinary as a cultural producer, we're also writing ourselves for all kinds of people, including ordinary readers. So we wanted to have all of those people as part of our audience.